morning, everybody. Good morning. I feel like I should just let you all talk because it might be the most productive thing that happens today. But we're going to get started. I'm just going to say a few things to start us off. First of all, I just thought if you were able to come last night, that was quite an amazing panel in terms of getting a number of different views out in a short period of time. I hope that's really what we're going to continue to do today. And I'm really, when I look out in the room and see who's here and the range of schools and the range of different roles that people play at those schools, I'm pretty excited about the way today could go. So one thing I did want to say is we do have contingent faculty and graduate students here, right, and probably some untenured folks as well. So we closed it to the press for that reason. Now, you know, people are going to tweet, et cetera, so, but please, you know, try to be kind and not expose anyone unnecessarily to criticism from their departments or their graduate advisors or something like that. So we are doing a video today. The speakers will be videoed this morning. In the afternoon, I've asked our video expert to do some individual interviews with people. So we'll ask, you know, obviously, you know, we won't tie you up and force you to give an interview. But we would like to get some different views up on the website, both the MLA website and our website. So if you're interested in doing that, we'd be very pleased to work with you on it. Okay. So I was just going to talk a little bit about another sort of genesis for today, and that was the conference they had up at McGill last spring, which was truly national. People from all over Canada came, and it was a 4-day conference, Reinventing the PhD, from which I stole this idea. So at that conference, we did talk about all of these different ways of rethinking what we do with our PhD programs. And I just wanted to mention some of them because, you know, I think they're gradually going to come out during the day, but we could at least have a little bit of a framework. So one of them that I thought was very interesting that I hadn't thought of was, you know, most programs have a small number of PhD students. Why are these programs not tailored to the individual student? I mean, so many students come in and take a required course, for instance, that they've maybe already taken at the undergraduate level or master's level. So that was one of the suggestions from a former provost at McGill. Alternatives to the dissertation, that's a very interesting question, and I kept thinking that people were going to come up with some really radical alternatives, such as the graphic novel that was published by the student at Columbia recently. But really the most engaged and interested faculty members kept coming back to the concern that the traditional dissertation was really the kind of intellectual breakthrough project that students needed to do. So I think it's going to be interesting to see if we can think through that here today. You know, what are other kinds of projects that would accomplish the same goals as the dissertation currently accomplishes? Public interest internships and the idea that from the very beginning, we would be introducing students to the idea that academic employment is not plan A, and then there's some kind of alternative plan B or even plan Fs after that, right? But that there are a number of different possible As, right? So that is something I think all of the programs agreed that they wanted to do much better with. One thing we're doing here at Georgetown now in the graduate school is having various graduate programs organized around issues. So the issue of aging, the issue of global infectious disease, the issue of the urban, okay? And the idea of developing some humanities graduate programs that are more issue focused than they are, for instance, a traditional program in English. And that's not going to be the answer. I think for some students that would provide a interesting alternative to the traditional path. I mean, I talked to a lot of students who they want a PhD in the humanities and they end up in English because it's more of a catch-all category than because they really wanted to be in an English PhD program. And it does allow them to do a lot of different things. Most of us in English, our programs are umbrella programs for all kinds of other things. So that's another thing to think about. And then finally, just to articulate professional development goals and ideas from the very beginning of the program. And I think there are programs out there, I ran into some of them at McGill, I hear about them here, that do that very well from a very early stage, but there are many that never do. I mean, so the students just really aren't exposed to what the sort of array of possibilities is for them. They aren't encouraged to develop the kinds of public speaking skills that Jane McAuliffe was talking about yesterday, or the collaborative skills that she talked about. So to articulate those as, you know, I know we hate all this assessment language, but learning goals, you know, from early on I think is quite important. So those are just some of the things we talked about at McGill, and some of the things I'm sure we'll be talking about throughout the day today. So for the rest of this our little kind of opening panel this morning, I do want to introduce Jessie Allen. She is a law professor and former performance artist, currently at University of Pittsburgh. She really brings the humanities and law together in some very interesting ways, and she's going to talk about that a little bit this morning. And of course, most of you know Ricardo Ortiz, current chair of the English department and the original thought leader on this project.
So thanks, Catherine, and welcome everyone again. Sorry. I'm doing this without notes, so I don't think I'll ramble, and I don't think I'll go more than 5 minutes. But forgive me if I stumble over myself. English is my second language, and I'm still trying to master it after 45 years. Anyway, so I actually wanted to give you a different sort of genesis story, not an alternative, but an additional one to what we're doing here today. And it really is sort of specific to Georgetown and to how this process kind of got started here in our Department of English. And so I can start by saying, and this is an announcement I've made many times in the course of the last 10 years at Georgetown and in different settings. We're the only top 25 ranked institution in this country of higher education that calls itself a university that's never had a doctoral program in English. So I made that announcement once at an Association of Departments of English meeting in Palo Alto in 2011, and David Lawrence, who's the director of AD and MLA, looked at me and said, this is the middle of a panel on the future of the humanities PhD. David Lawrence looked at me and said, yeah, well, Georgetown is sort of the poster child for the problem or the question that we would need to ask about, what a kind of future version of an English PhD in particular would look like. So in our department, really, at least as far back as the 1990s, there'd already been a kind of interest in our attempting to establish a doctoral program, because we look both within the context of Georgetown and without, like the poster child, like the prime candidate for doing something like this. So over the years, we had attempted it. We had task forces, we had committees. We got to the point, every 5 years or so of actually almost putting together something that looked like a proposal. The last time that we sort of did it in earnest that I remembered was in around sort of 2008, 2009, and Catherine was definitely instrumental in that process. And then the financial crisis happened, and we were told to just drop it. It would never happen. It would never work. So we waited for a while and let everything sort of blow over and let the what there's been of a recovery to happen, and then sort of brought it back and tried it one more time in the course of 2012 into 2013 into 2014, and so there was a moment, and this was, we brought together a number of different sort of stakeholders in our department and across all levels of the faculty. So from some of our part-time colleagues to full-time non-tenure line to tenure line, both untenured and tenured, to sort of think about what this would look like and to sort of imagine what we were proposing, what the prospect of this was going to be. And it sort of fell to me at one point in the summer of 2013, so already more than 2 full years ago, to sit down one day and to, with a blank computer screen in front of me, and to start to actually imagine putting together a proposal, just having an argument to be made for why anyone in this country, anywhere, even at Georgetown, right, would want to establish a new doctoral program in English, given everything that we know about the market and everything we know about sort of not just the future of the humanities, but all the sort of forms of shifting ground that are sort of occurring kind of simultaneously in the profession, right, in higher education in general, but certainly to doctoral level research and teaching and hiring in the humanities. And the first thing that sort of occurred to me is that, wow, you know, what we can't do here is put together something that would be a version of, you know, something that would claim, oh, I know what, we'll get like a wooden container, put wheels on it, and have horses drag it, and we'll put people in it, and they'll move, and we'll call that transportation, right? That couldn't happen. We couldn't do a version of that. We couldn't propose a doctoral program that looked like all the many doctoral programs in this country that came into being, you know, 100 or more years ago, at a time when that actually looked like a good idea to have that many of them, right? And so that opened a door. It actually wasn't, it was a challenge to begin with. It felt a little bit like an obstacle, but it actually opened a door because it meant that what we really needed to do, and you know, this is what I brought back to our task force, what we really needed to do was to find a way to invent something, you know, and I guess we can talk about the relationship between invention and reinvention, that would both look enough like the thing that we wanted to do given sort of historical precedent and existing models, right, but still did something fundamentally different and new that could just open a door into what this was going to have to look like in the future, what would become a kind of model for future practice, right? You know, yesterday listening to our panelists talk about you know, all the different sort of contributions that they brought to that conversation was really, really instructive for me because it sort of reinforced a number of things that I think are sort of on the table for us, right? I think to the extent that if there are two challenges that present themselves to us, one is practical and the other is ethical, but they both sort of have to work in you know, simultaneously, right, in tandem with one another. Or in tandem with one another, and they really just have to do with, on the one hand, sort of figuring this out so that we're making a kind of meaningful contribution not only to the lives of the people who would want to pursue this kind of path into our profession, for whatever reason, this would be the way that they would want to do it, and at the same time, coordinate enough in ways that I don't think that we do sort of as a profession, as an industry, as whatever you want to call the thing that we are, to make it worthwhile, to make it viable, to make it feasible, to make it something that can actually, you know, I can't help but sort of go back to some economic analogies, right? I just wonder what this would look like if we had, you know, maybe a more centralized place to do a certain kind of macroeconomic sort of policy making that would sort of right the ship in ways that we don't have institutional structures that do that. We're sort of doing it in this sort of islandized way, institution by institution. At the same time, that what we would want is something like a model of full employment, right, where people actually, where there's a kind of coordination of supply and demand, where we're only sort of supplying as many people as there's a demand for. How do we do that? How do we sort of avoid surpluses, right, that don't that basically just fall out of the economy or feel like excess, and not just to the institution, not just to the profession, but to the people who are actually literally falling outside of that structure. I think I'll end there, but thank you very much, and I'm really looking forward to today's discussion.
So I'm Jessie Allen from the University of Pittsburgh, where I teach law, and I'm really delighted, Catherine, that you invited me, because I am a very interdisciplinary kind of person and lawyer and law professor, so I have long been really interested in understanding more about the relationship, and I'm going to make an argument later, identity of law and the humanities. And I have to say, it's interesting to be in this room having this conversation, because more often I'm in a room full of law professors discussing what the value of legal education is to the world of law. As you probably know, we have our intersecting or parallel crisis in legal education. And I don't think it's an accident, actually, that legal education and the humanities are embattled departments. And I'll come back to that. So, I thought I would just tell you a little bit more context for who I am, my background, and then I'm going to make an argument, a brief and informal argument, because that's what lawyers do today, that it's not just that there's value in the legal world for the humanities, that the humanities could bring value, yes, but that in fact law is one of the humanities. So, who am I? Well, I have a JD and I have a doctorate, but not a PhD. I have one of those odd bastard doctorates. Mine is a JSD. So I have the experience of a doctoral program. But as Catherine mentioned, for many years before I went to either of those educational experiences, I was a performance artist. I was an actor first, and then a writer and a performance artist. And so I have this really checkered background that certainly informs my sense of that, what we're doing here. Then, after both of those, I was a lawyer for quite a few years before I came to the Academy. In fact, initially when after having been a performance artist for a while, decided I was going to go back to some form of graduate education, I was deciding between going to a philosophy department to get a PhD and going to law school. And ultimately, I said, well, I'm going to go to law school because I know I don't want to be an academic. Anyway, so much for plan A, right? Anyhow, so the kind of lawyer that I was, you can basically say I was a civil rights litigator. I did other things too, but I represented classes of people in constitutional challenges, mostly to voting rights restrictions. And I did that, and it gave me a lot of joy for a number of years. But I think my reason for coming back to the Academy gives you some preview of my sense of law as a humanity, and that is because what I missed from my performance days was the feeling of looking into the world and having all of the things that happened feed into a kind of project that was a way of thinking about the world that I think is what people classically in the humanities have. You have this dissertation or this line of study, and then sort of everything that you do can come into that space. And I think that might be, when I'm thinking of questions to explore today, the one that I keep coming back to is sort of, what is it that really makes the humanities the humanities? What is it that we do that is that thing? So, okay, to my argument. So my understanding is we're here to articulate the value to the world of the humanities and of advanced education in the humanities. And I was told that I represent the world on this panel as the law, right? But in that contrarian way that lawyers have, my immediate impulse is, I'm not the world, I'm not the world. And so I thought, well, maybe I'm the humanities. So here's my argument that law is one of the humanities. Now, first let me start, as lawyers do, with the counter-arguments that I can defeat, right? Obviously, Jane McAuliffe yesterday talked about the deep dive into content, and that being this really valuable thing that is the center of higher education in the humanities. And Lawyers, not so much on the deep dive, right? Classically, the superficial skate across the surface, grab eclectically from every little thing you can and make these arguments that are, you know, all up in the air and are not serious, that don't dive deep. So there's that. And then there's this other structural difference that I think is really interesting for this project, and that is that the Legal Academy has the model already as between the professors and the students that I hear being considered as the future of the humanities department model. In other words, our students do not replicate us. Outside of Yale anyway, all of the law students who are there, you know, a tiny fraction of them are going to become law professors. So the law professors are teaching presumably at a fairly high level in what's a 3-year program, graduate program, to students, almost none of whom are looking to replicate their law professors, but to go out and do something else. So, you know, in a sense, law professors have had to figure out how to contribute to the development of knowledge, to do serious scholarship, to develop a continuous scholarly agenda and to connect with the academy in other ways while teaching at a fairly high level people who are not going to cycle back and do that. So there might be something there to consider as a way to think about that model. You know, I wish I could say, and look how wildly successful it is, but no, it's in battle too. Which brings me to why I think law is one of the humanities, or why the humanities are law. There are obvious content similarities and skill similarities, right? Words, words, words. We read, we write, we articulate, we talk, we stand up and make. And certainly a fruitful overlap to explore, but you all know that, so I'm not talking about that. I think that the big thing that makes law one of the humanities or the humanities law is a dedication to form. This fascination with and interest in form as something that has transformative power. It seems to me that law and the humanities both are these enterprises that try to feed all of this stuff, this chaotic, violent, bad stuff, into a form that then produces something good out of it, right? Makes poetry out of child abuse, makes justice out of murder. And I think there's something about this love of form. So, you know, this leads me to another commonality. It's not exactly the same kind of commonality, but you know, in the academy, and outside of the academy for that matter, law has been incredibly resistant to empirical science. I mean, for better and for worse. Law as an institution and social institution and as an academic discipline has really fought off the colonization of reason. I mean, we just aren't having it. And we watch other departments be overtaken with empirical studies, and they've definitely come into the academy in a way that they had not before. But man, they have not taken over. And this has for centuries been the progressive lament, right? From Jeremy Bentham to Oliver Wendell Holmes to Richard Posner, he's progressive. I mean, it's like, what is wrong with you crazy lawyers? Why can't you see reason and be scientific and think about the consequences of what you're doing here? You know, be reasonable. And lawyers, law and lawyers are just, no, we're not reasonable. We're not doing that. And we're the humanities. We're into form. We're into this thing that's not reason. So that's obviously problematic, and I think I'll venture to say it's a, lousy functionalist argument, but you might think it has some causal contribution to why both are embattled in the academy at the moment. Doubtless there are many other more reasonable economic causal factors. So I guess I'll just close then by saying, if law is the humanity, or one of the humanities, do you say a humanity? I was puzzling with that earlier. Okay, one of the humanities, part of the humanities. Then, and it's not just about reading and writing. Well, Peter Brooks yesterday said it's all reading, right? And in a way, I think that must be right, that it's all reading. But I'd like to suggest that it might be the exact opposite that we're looking for, too, which of course winds up being the same thing, two sides of the same coin, right? Like, can we think about, this is my question, what would the humanities and law look like? We could leave law aside because we're talking about the humanities. So what would the humanities look like if in a world where we were no longer reading and writing? Like, is there something, at some other level? Like, because honestly, reading and writing might go away. Like, that could really happen, I think. I don't think, in our lifetimes or our children's lifetimes, but it really might happen. I wouldn't be that, I could imagine a science fiction something that sounded plausible. That, at least as we know them, those might turn out not to be the end game. But I don't think humanities would disappear then. I really don't. I think there would still be humanities. Well, what could that look like? Now, I'm not suggesting that we spend the rest of the day thinking about, how to prepare doctoral students for a world in which there's no reading and writing. That wouldn't be very useful. But I do think that just thinking of that possibility might raise some questions about how to think outside the old box, outside the old wooden box on wheels of the humanities today. So that's all I have.